Hello, everybody. Good to see you all. So, welcome to our adult Bible study session. Last week, we answered some of the questions about what the Bible is and who wrote the Bible. So, we have some idea about these. We have some easy answers, but that have to be explained. Like if you say God wrote the Bible, there's a meaning to that. And then we talked about the fact that human beings wrote the Bible, but they wrote the Bible using their own culture, using their own expressions, using their own history, using their own stories. Okay, so I want to continue. We are going to now talk about the stories in the Bible. But before we do that, let me first read for you again what we said the Bible is. When we say the question, what is the Bible? We said the Bible is a library of books, and that these books are composed by Israelites, Jews, and Christians. Israelites, Jews, and Christians. And that, what did they write in these books? In that we said these books together tell faith stories. The stories in these books are not scientific stories. They are faith stories. They are stories, some of them are histories, some of them have an idea about a little bit of science, but they are not about science. These stories in the Bible are stories that are colored by the eyes of faith. They were written by believers in God. So they have kind of written the story in such a way that it is to bring faith, to help people to believe in God. Okay. So the stories are designed like that. The stories in the Bible are all there to help us to believe in a higher power, and that power and everything that has to do with that higher power, that power that we call God. These faith stories lead us to have an idea of this God. So when you read the stories, then the stories talk about, the stories you're going to hear, they talk about God's action in the world, what God is doing. You will hear stories about God. You will hear the Israelites talking about God opened the sea for us, and we walked through it. And then when our enemies were chasing us, they wanted to come kill us, God closed the sea. They are saying that God is acting, the actions of God. So the stories tell about God's action in the world. So that when you read these stories and you read the actions of God, you come to know who God is. We come to know who God is and what He will do or what she will do in your life here today. What God will do in my life. I read the story in the Bible, and the story in the Bible tells me about God's action with a particular group of people. Now you can ask yourself, what will God do with people like us now who are under pressure of COVID-19? What will God do? Now if you read a story, there's a story in the Bible that tells you what God did for people who were in a particular situation like ours. And God saved them when they cry out to God, when they put their faith in God, when they listen to what God has to say, they were saved. How God saved them, we can take a lesson from that. And then that will tell us how to live today. So I said, let us now take the Bible and go through it all. This is the library. let us take this library and take all the books and find out the key stories that you will find in each book. The stories. The caution I want to give you is that the stories we are going to tell right now they are sometimes very hard to believe or hard to understand or hard to even accept, because some of the stories don't add up. I've told you that already, because they were written by human beings, and these stories are not mostly something that happened. Some of them happened, but they have been colored with faith. So sometimes it sounds like exaggeration, it sounds like unbelievable, but that is not what the Bible is about. The Bible doesn't care to be wrong physically. The Bible doesn't care to have things not adding up. The Bible is teaching us something else. The Bible is teaching us values. So the values are the ones that we want to follow, not just the story as it is. Remember, we talked about fundamentalism. We are not going to be fundamental over here. In this Bible study, the adult Bible study, can put up with the fact that you have a story that is told, and that story teaches you a lesson. And if it teaches you a lesson, a way of living, then that story is true. You are not saying that it actually happened. Truth doesn't mean it actually happened. So let us take the stories. Now, the stories are also they're like the signpost. I've always used this as the way to understand what I'm saying here. The stories are like signposts. The signpost in the corner of your street. And the signpost points to a place and says, that is Dublin. If you follow the sign, what the sign is telling you, you will get to Dublin. But you cannot stand by the sign because it's written Dublin on it. You cannot stand by the sign and say you are in Dublin. The sign points you. So the story, the biblical story, the story you're going to hear, they are signs. The signs are pointing to the values. So when you read the story, you ask yourself, what value is it pointing me to? Don't ask scientific, don't try to beat the story, because the story sometimes doesn't, sometimes some of them don't make deeper sense. Some of them don't add up. You can ask thousands of questions about these stories. You can hear people living a life of 900 years old, 600 years old. People are living a lot of some kind of number of years that you will not be, you cannot believe. Okay, so that's what we're going to hear right now, the stories in the Bible. And so we're going to start from just Genesis, and we're going to take each book. We're going to treat about 2 books today, perhaps, but we're going to go on and on and on and on and on. This is what is going to happen until we finish in Revelation. Okay, so let's take the stories of the Bible, and let's take Genesis. And Genesis, the book of Genesis, was written by the Israelites. The book was written by the Israelites. The Israelites were a people already. They were people who had writers. Their sacred writers are the ones who wrote Genesis. And they wrote that this is the way the world came to be. So in Genesis, you have chapters 1 to 11 that talks about how the world came to be, not just Israelites, but the entire world. The Israelites are telling their story about how the whole world came to be, and also trying to teach us why sin came to the world, why somebody looks at somebody and able to kill the person, why evil came to the world, how this happened. So the Israelites are trying to answer those questions. In Genesis chapters 1 to 11, we call this part of the book of Genesis the prehistory of humanity. We say prehistory of humanity. It's now we cannot account for that in any historical books. Okay, this is faith story. It's a story being told by a people who want us to know how certain things were happening in their world. So the first one is the creation of the world, the creation of things, and the creation of human beings. This creation, I told you some time ago, is the first covenant, because when God created people, or God created things, they established a relationship. Creation starts with relationship. So once you create something, once you give birth to a child, you have established a relationship. You now have a relationship between that child and you. So when God created, the creatures become God's creatures, and God became the creator. So there's a relationship between creator and creatures. So creation, how God created the world, which is in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. There are two creation stories in the Bible. The first one talks about human beings were created last after everything has been created. Human beings were created last. And you know about that. We talk about in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be this, and there was this. Let there be that, until the sixth day when God created humans. Humans were the last to be created. And that story tells us that human beings are the climax of creation. Human beings are the epitome of creation. Okay. I have a question here right away. Why use he or she gender to refer to God? So, okay, so then you hear that we use he a lot in the Bible. But the he that is being used, or the gender that is being used, God is genderless. God is not a particular gender. God is a spirit. But the people who wrote, the Israelites who wrote the scriptures, who wrote that, they experienced God in their culture already. The male is considered the provider. The male assumes certain roles, the paternal role. And so they figured God in that. He has to tell his people the story. But how do you represent a spirit to other people? You have to give it a gender. So in their society, that is what God is. They experience God like a father, the roles that fathers play in their community. But if you read the Bible very well, you come to see that there are feminine roles also in God. There's a place in the Bible that God says, come and drink of my breast, abundant breast. Come and I carried you in my womb. Oh, Israel, you are my child. What father does a role like that? So it is very important from now to begin in adult way to understand the Bible and say, the Bible is not about the gender. It's about parenting. When the Bible says father, what the Bible actually wants to say is parent. The bigger word is parent. But in their society, they see the male as the one who controls, who provides, And God is a father. God is a mother too. God is a mother for us too. God is neither. The Israelites are the ones who wrote the Bible, and they wrote it using their culture. We in 2020 can also bring our culture. Once you're reading the Bible, you bring your culture in there and see. Then you'll be able to see God's hand in some of the things that we do in our lives. Let us continue. So creation of the humans. So in Genesis chapters 1 to 11, the stories you find are first the creation of human beings, creation of everything. But I've told you that the first story of creation is about human beings being the epitome of creation. Human beings are supposed they are special. They are supposed to manage. They are managers of the world. Human beings are supposed to manage the world and discover all the secrets in the world and continue to recreate, to help God to recreate. So that's what we find there. In the second story, human beings were created first. It starts from Genesis chapter 2, verses 1b. So you start reading the second story that says the human being was created. Adam was created first, and then Adam was not happy, so God created animals. And then the animals didn't make it, so God created a second human being. You remember the rib story? The rib story tells that is the second creation story. So you have two creation stories in the Bible. But remember that these stories are about Israelites trying to tell how the world was created, not how they were created, how the whole world was created. The whole world was there. They wanted to just account for it. There was no video recording. It wasn't like somebody was standing there and God was created and they were writing it down. No. They were living in a world where there is war, there is evil, and there is all kinds of things. And they want to find out, how did these things come about? So they are trying to help us to understand, have a little context about how the world came to be and how it came to be that people are killing people or evil is in the world. Why is the human being? Why is it that you will do your best? You will try very hard to teach your child to do good things, and they will still do bad things. Where does that come from? Why is that with human beings? What is about the human being that the human being will sometimes like to do wrong? The Israelites want to explain that with those stories. Okay. So you go on, another story you find in Genesis chapters 1 to 11 is that the first human beings who were created, this is their story, that the first two human beings, they disobeyed the Creator. Okay? They disobeyed the Creator. They violated the relationship. God created them. It's like you have your child in the home, and the child is growing up. The child knows all the rules of the house and then breaks the rule. That's what happened, that human beings were given that freedom and they broke the covenant. So when they broke the rule, they broke it, and God, this is what brought that evil into the world, or sin. Sin is breaking our terms of the relationship we have with God. If you break that term of relationship, that is what we call sin. So that sin that the first humans committed spread. First of all, it spread through, it became something that human beings were doing to each other. And that is what we hear from the spread of sin in the personal level. Sin spread, let's say first of all, the two humans, Adam and Eve, disobeyed the Creator. And so they fell. So they became people who do wrong. They became people who do wrong. Human beings, from the beginning, they were good. But from the time they fell, they became people who are able to do wrong things. And that wrong thing began to spread. First of all, in the interpersonal relationship. And that is explained by the story of the two boys of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had two babies. And those two babies are Cain and Abel. And then Cain killed his brother Abel because he was jealous about Abel's good deeds in the eyes of God. So Cain killed his brother Abel, but that, don't ask a question, because Cain married, Cain had babies, and Cain's babies survived. It is possible to ask the question, where did Cain get a woman to marry? Who did he marry? Don't ask that question, because there's no answer for it. Okay? He didn't marry his mother either. So, but the Bible doesn't care about that. That's not what the story is. Story is not interested in the accuracy. That's not accurate. But we are not about that. We are about how did sin come into the world in the interpersonal? Why will somebody look at somebody's face and just shoot him or kill him or do harm to him? It was the first disobedience to God which spread to the interpersonal level. Cain killed his brother Abel. So human beings could do that. Human beings now inherited the evil of being able to do harm to another human being. And then it also spread in the social level. If you read the story of the Tower of Babel, the community comes together to do wrong. The evil in society. All these things, the Israelite is going to tell us how they started. Why is it that a group of people come together and have conspiracy and gossip and do all kinds of things against another person? You can see it when we read those stories. So I'm just mentioning the stories you will find in the Bible. The next story you will find there is that sin spread through the world, according to the Israelites, so much that sin was so much all over the place, so God decided to renew the world. God decided to flash off sin and then reorganize humans. So that is the story of the flood that you will hear with the story of Noah. Doesn't mean that it actually occurred, but the Israelite is trying to explain that God did not abandon human beings. It is not in God's character to abandon human beings forever because they sinned or because they went away. God is always a merciful God. So God repaired the world through the story of Noah and the flood. And that's what we consider the second relationship. I mean, this is renewing or repairing the relationship with human beings. We will come back there to read the stories. These stories will go deeper into them, but now we're just mentioning the stories. So when you pick the book in Genesis chapters 1 to 11, you know what to expect. You know the stories that are there. The next story you will find is Noah, when God flushed the whole world. According to the Israelite story, God flushed the whole world and preserved some species of creation so that they can be like a down payment for the ongoing of humanity. So humanity was not totally thrown away, but God saved some who will be the remnants, who will be the beginning of a new relationship with God. So that is the story of Noah and all the different animals that Noah took with him and his family, and they were in the ark. So Noah's descendants after that, after God has renewed the world, there is a story also that, a lot of stories that talk about the descendants of Noah. Who are those people? There are three groups of people. There are the Sethites, there are the Japhites, and there are the Hamites. Okay, the Sethites have their ancestor. Noah had 3 children. His 3 children are Seth, Japheth, and Ham. Okay, Seth, Japheth, and Ham. So Seth's descendants are what are called the Sethites. The Japhites are the descendants of Japheth, and Hamites are the descendants of Ham. Okay. Now, with these 3 children, there is a story about these 3 children. One time, Noah was drunk and he was naked. There's a story in the Bible like that. He was naked and his clothes were falling off, and Ham looked at his father and laughed at him and went and told other people that this is his father. He was just laughing with other people, laughing at his father. But Seth and Japheth, they took a cloth and went and covered their father's nakedness. So when Noah woke up, the Bible says he cursed Ham. He cursed Ham and cursed him and says, "You and your descendants will be slaves of your brothers." So the Hamites are considered those who are the bad guys, and the Japhites and Sethites are those who are considered good guys. So this is what is going to go on until Abraham. Abraham is the grandson of one of the Sethites. Okay. So the Bible tells all this story about prehistory that we cannot account for, but these are just stories. They are myths. Some of them are myths. Prehistory. Those things in Genesis chapters 1 to 11 are not exactly histories. They are not. Don't go looking for Noah's Ark. Doesn't exist. A lot of people came up some time ago as we found Noah's Ark. That's not true. This is Israelite stories to explain how sin came to the world and the specialty of human beings. That human beings are the epitome of creation, and that they are the ones who are managers of the world. So these are the stories you will find. I have sent you handouts. You can always look at that. But these are the stories you should expect in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Now let's go on to Genesis chapters 12 through 50. Okay, Genesis chapters 12 through 50 is about the prehistory of Israel. Now, remember, the first one is the prehistory of the entire world. Israelites were chosen as if you like, a specimen of the entire world. But God is interested in the entire world. But God chose Israel to use as a gateway to enter humanity, to help human beings. So Israel is just representing the rest of humanity. Israel did not merit to be selected. It is God's own free will to select a group of people that represent humanity. But the buck does not stop with Israel. Israel is just a gateway. So we have a question here. When did the Israelites write Genesis? 13th centuries BC? Was it when they were under the Egyptian rule or much earlier? So we're going to deal with, thank you for the question. I would like to keep this question because we are going to deal with the dates of when the books of the Bible were written. Okay. So we will come to those questions. Right now, let us talk about the stories that are there. So Genesis chapters 12 through 50 is the prehistory of Israel's ancestry, how Israel came to be as a community. And how it came to be is that a man called Abraham, or Abram, that's his name from the beginning, Abram was called by God. He was living with his family in a place called Haran. And Haran is found in present day. If you look at the map, there's a map I want to show you right now. You see the top of the map, there's a place written Haran. If you look at the blue line from the bottom is Ur. And Ur is in a place called Babylonia. Okay, Babylonia. This place is present-day Iraq. Ur is in Iraq. So these people that we are talking about, Noah and all those people, they are Iraqi. They come from those areas. They come from Babylonia. They come from Mesopotamia. But Abram and his family moved from Ur to Haran in the north. Okay. Now in Haran, this is where God called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, the Bible starts with the story that God called this man and says, "Go, I will show you a land. I'm taking you to a promised land. And I will make you the father of nations." So Abraham left Haran, and the blue line coming down shows how Abraham traveled. He traveled all the way through Israel, the present-day Israel, but went all the way. You can see the blue line goes on to a place called Zoar. That is Egypt. So Abraham actually traveled to Egypt, but then came back. You see the second line coming back. Abraham came back and settled in a place called Beersheba. That is around the Dead Sea in Israel. Those of you who have gone to Israel before, you know where Beersheba can be found. It's around the Dead Sea. So that is where Abraham settled. Okay? And Abraham settled there. That is where Abraham, let us go back to the clip. So in the book of Genesis, Abraham traveled. You will hear a story where Abraham was called. His name was changed. He was given a promise. God promised that he will give him a land for his descendants. So Abraham, there's another story that says Abraham journeyed through Canaan to Egypt. And there was a story about Abraham in Egypt. When he went to Egypt with his wife Sarah, when they were in Egypt, Abraham was afraid that he would be killed because Sarah was a beautiful woman. And he thought that he would be killed by the kings of Egypt. So he lied that Sarah was his sister. So Abraham told the people, "Sarah is my sister, not my wife." So they will not kill him and take his wife. But when the people found out, they became mad and they threw him out. So that's how he came back to Beersheba in Israel. So you will also hear the story that Abraham returned to Shechem Beersheba, and there are stories about Lot and the pillar of salt and Sodom and Gomorrah. You hear all those stories because Abraham and Sarah, they could not have children. But they did have, Abraham had a son because Sarah could not bear a child. Sarah told the slave girl that was living with them. A slave girl that was living with them was called Hagar. So Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to have a baby. Because the fact is that God has promised him to be the father of nations. If he's going to be a father of nations, he needs a child. So they forced that. Sarah gave Hagar to her husband, and so Hagar made a baby. So that baby's name was Ishmael. Now, Ishmael was the child of the slave girl. So, Hagar began to flex her muscles in the house because she made a baby, and Sarah did not make a baby. So she began to feel very important in the house, and the Bible says that Sarah abused her, and they had to send her and the child into the desert. So Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, were abandoned to the desert of Arabia. And so Ishmael is the one who is considered the father of Arabs. Okay, Arabs. And I mean Arabs, not Muslims. Arabs. Arab is an ethnic group. So Ishmael's descendants are the ones who became Arabs because they were abandoned to the desert of Arabia. Okay. Now, you will see, therefore, that Abraham, therefore, had babies. Had a next son, but the next son was given by Sarah after over 90 years old. Sarah was 90 years old, and Abraham was over 100 years old, but they still had a miracle baby. So the miracle baby is the one that is supposed to carry on the promise. So you see, when God called Abraham, God told Abraham, whenever you have a child, pass on the blessing to the child. And then the blessing will be passed on and on and on and on until you realize the promised land that I'm giving you. So the blessings was going to be passed on. Blessings are going to be passed on. So Abraham had only two children. The first one could not get the blessing because he was Ishmael and was born by the slave girl. The second one is Isaac. So Isaac was the one who got the blessing. Now Isaac too married a woman called Rebekah. You will see the story of how he got married. Isaac married Rebekah, and they had two children. They had Jacob and Esau. Okay. But who got the blessing? So the blessing has to go on. They have to pass on the blessing. They were supposed to pass on the blessing to the older child, Esau, but Jacob stole the blessing from him by the father, Isaac, could not see, so they conspired. Jacob conspired with his mother. His mother, Rebekah, helped him, and they stole the birthright of Esau. So Jacob was the one who carried the blessing. Okay, he took the blessing, and then Jacob himself, since he stole his brother's inheritance, his brother wanted to kill him. So what he did was he ran away. He ran away, and he went to the place where his father comes from, Haran area. he went to find a wife. So Jacob flees and goes, you hear that story, flees and goes to Bethel and goes to Haran and married. He married there. There's a story there that you will hear that will not sit well with you. But again, don't get stuck with the story. Listen to find out what is the story trying to teach. Jacob was going to marry from his grandfather's hometown. And when he got there, he found his future father-in-law, and he told the future father-in-law he wants to marry Rachel. Rachel was the one that Jacob saw and wanted to marry her. So the father-in-law told Jacob, you got to work a little bit for her. Work about 1 year or 2 years. So he worked like a dowry. And when the time came for him to marry, that night in their marriage custom, the woman will be thrown in the room of the man. And the man has to sleep with the wife, and then the next day, then rituals will be done, and then they will take the wife home. The father-in-law deceived Jacob. Jacob worked for 2 years for Rachel, but the father-in-law threw Leah, the older girl, threw Leah into Jacob's room. The room was dark, so Jacob could not see, so he slept with Leah. When morning came and Jacob found out that that is not Rachel, this is Leah, he protested and he said, no, I wanted Rachel, not Leah. And Jacob's father-in-law says, oh, well, you have slept with her, so that's your wife now. But if you want if you want Rachel, by all means, then you can work for 2 more years, and then you can marry her too. So that is what Jacob did. He worked for more years, and then married 2 sisters. So Jacob married 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, and brought them home but these 2 women could not at first give birth. Each of them had a slave girl, a servant girl. So Jacob slept with the servant girls to make babies for these women before they also began to have babies. They themselves have babies. So Jacob actually slept with these 4 women. All the babies of Jacob were made from 4 women. Rachel and her servant girl, and Leah and her servant girl. Okay. Don't ask questions about these things. Just follow the story. And then think about what the story is teaching. So then, these children of Jacob made 13 children. Well, there are more other children reported later on, but the ones that we know in the Bible are, we always talk about 12 sons of Jacob. Now, there are 12 sons of Jacob. But there was a woman, this is what I was telling you before. Jacob had a girl, I think it was the 10th born, was a girl who is called Dinah. But no one talks about Dinah. Because the Israelites writing this book, women are not accounted for. They always talk about men. Men are there. If someone tells you the Bible is very patriarchal in nature, that is true. The Bible is more male-centered, male-dominated. Okay. So, but that is from the culture of the people, the culture of the Israelites. So we count 12 sons of Jacob. These 12 sons, each of them represents one tribe of Israel. Each of them. So there are 12 tribes of Israel. They are all linked to Jacob's sons. All the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, linked to Jacob's sons. So the firstborn was Reuben. From Reuben to Benjamin was the last son. But Reuben was not the one who got the blessing. Instead, the fourth child, the fourth boy, who is called Judah. Judah is the one who got the blessing. And that is why, so you have 12 tribes, you have 12 groups, like ethnic groups, 12 of them. And all of them lived in Canaan or Israel at that time. They all lived where Abraham lived. Now, so what happens is that this story will end, the Bible, the book of Genesis, will end with a story that sees the tribes, all the 12 tribes of Israel, will be found in Egypt. So Genesis chapters 1 through 50 tell about Israelites going to Egypt. It ends with Egypt. How did they get to Egypt? Okay, that is what you will find in the last story. How Jacob's children, their sons, sold their brother. They sold their brother Joseph to Egypt. And when they sold him to Egypt, he prospered in Egypt. And he became a key figure who takes care of food rationing in Egypt. There was a famine, there was a hunger in Israel at that time, in Canaan at that time. And so Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to get food. And when they went there, you would see that beautiful story in Genesis chapter 39. They went there to get food. And they met their brother, but they didn't recognize him, that it was their brother that they sold to Egypt. So when the brother gave them the food, he worked out a trick on them and put the king's cup in the sack of the lastborn. When he put that in there, people started, there was a cry that the king's cup is missing, the king's cup is missing, so they had to search these Hebrew people's bags. When they searched their sacks, they found the cup in the lastborn's sack. So Joseph told them, we're going to keep your brother because your brother stole the king's cup. So we're going to keep him here. You all can go home. Can bring your grains home and tell your father the lastborn is kept here because he stole the king's cup. Now, they started crying and said that father is going to die. The father has lost Joseph already, has lost one son already. So if he loses this one, he's going to die. They started wailing, and that is how Joseph revealed himself to them and says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold to slavery. And now I want you to go back and tell my father that I am alive, and that I'm prospering, and that I want all of you to come and live with me. This is how Jacob and all the Hebrew people, all his descendants, moved from Canaan, where Abraham was living, where Abraham made his babies, Isaac made his babies, Jacob made his babies. They all moved to Egypt. And they moved to Egypt and settled in Egypt. And that is what ends the book of Genesis. So the book of Genesis ends that the Hebrew people, they are not Israel yet. Israel is a nation. But now they are just families. Families, big, huge families. 12 families that moved and went to Egypt and lived there, and the book of Genesis ends with that. The book of Genesis, the next book, which is the book of Exodus, will begin from there. Will begin from Egypt. Okay, so Genesis is about that. Genesis talks about the ancestry of Israel. And when they talk about the fathers or the patriarchs of Israel, the ancestors of Israel, they talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then they add one more name. They add Joseph's name. So the ancestors, when they are talking about what is the ancestor, who are the ancestors of Israel? What is the ancestors of Israel? You say Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Why did they add Joseph? Why didn't they add the one who got the blessing, Judah, instead? They add Joseph because Joseph is the key, is the reason why they went to Egypt. Joseph is the reason why they ended up in Egypt. And that is how the book of Exodus is going to pick up from there. It's going to start from there. As a matter of fact, when you read the book of Exodus, which we are going to deal with when we come back next Thursday, we'll see that whilst they were in Egypt, when they were in Egypt, they were doing fine until there was a revolution in Egypt. The kings that favored Joseph was overthrown. So there was a new chef in town. There was a new king of Israel. And that king didn't like the way the Hebrews were multiplying. They were breeding and they were becoming, they're like, these people are going to steal our job. They're stealing our everything. They're becoming too much. So they started oppressing the Hebrew people. When they were oppressing the Hebrew people, that is how the Hebrews began to cry out to God, and God is going to enter into that history to save them. We're going to talk about that in the book of Exodus. But Genesis now, Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is the prehistory, tells about the prehistory of humanity, the whole world, not just Israel, the whole world. But the Israelites were telling those stories. They were telling the story about how the world came to be. That is not the only story of how the world came to be. There are many stories. There are many people. If you go to my people in Ghana, in Ghana, we have a story about how the world came to be, a traditional story. The Irish have traditional stories about how things came about. Human beings have that. Societies have myths and fables and stories. And in many of these stories, you can hear animals talking. Animals talking. I mean, like the book of Genesis, you hear the snake talking. The snake was talking to Eve and Adam. Don't get stuck with that. There is a meaning to it. The stories are trying to tell us some meaning. Okay? So we have Genesis chapters 1 to 11. There's stories told about the creation of the world. And then you have chapters 12 to 50 that talks about how Israel began. Okay? So Israel's existence, how Israel came to be, chapters 12 to 11 to 50. Chapters 1 to 11 is how humanity came to be. And Israel is going to be the sample. They're going to be the example that God is going to use to tell the rest of the world how God deals with the rest of the world. Israel is just a specimen, a sample that God uses to test about humanity. Israel is the gateway. That's why Jesus is going to come through Israel to save the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is the reason, is what God is looking for, not just Israel. God is interested in humanity, all of us. Israel was used as an example, as a gateway to help for God to enter the world. We will stop here and we will take the next 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to answer some questions. Do we have any question there? No. Any question? Anybody has a question? You can raise your hand. We can see.
You need to use the raise your hand button.
Yeah. So when we come back next week, we are going to look at. Oh.
Tell Erwin to say his question again.
Okay, Erwin has a question. Yes. So the question is, when was Genesis written? The book of all these stories that you see were not written at one particular moment. The books, like all the stories in Genesis, for instance, they were not written in one. It took tens, sometimes hundreds of years. They collected the stories and put them together. Okay. So, for instance, when you're talking about Genesis, the way we came to know how Genesis was written is that there are certain parts of Genesis that were written in 900 BC, 900 years before Christ. Okay, 900 years before Christ. Certain parts were written in 800 BC. Other parts were written in 700 BC, and the latest part was written in 600 BC. So we are able to look at the way they have written them. This is what we are going to learn as we go forward. I'm going to talk about that. The different parts, how you will know that a particular writing comes from 900 BC. Okay, so. But if you put them all together, you will say the book of Genesis, the stories in the book of Genesis were composed between 900 BC to 600 BC. That is enough to say as an answer right now, but we are going to go deeper into that. We are going to talk about each of the books and when they were written. Right now, we will continue to talk about all the stories. So I hope and pray that when you pick up the Bible, when you pick up Genesis, you know what stories are in Genesis. We will deal with the interpretation of those stories another time. So
there was another question here.
There's one more question before we leave.
Yeah, I got a copy over here.
Okay. So many of these people will have relations with slaves, etc. Was adultery acceptable so they could do what was expected of them prior to Moses? Okay, so again, this is prehistory of Israel. This is way before 10 Commandments came about. Okay, there were no commandments here. The only thing that was here is that there was no the story. These stories are very much faith colored. So they are not looking at some morals or some things like that. God told me to do this and I did it. That's what they were doing at that time. And remember that these are stories. These are myths and colored stories and faith. Let me tell you how this is told. These stories are told. If you witness an accident, you can say that, for instance, someone who went through an accident that almost occurred but didn't occur, you can say, God saved me from the accident. You can say that. That is, if you believe in God, You are looking at the way that you escaped the accident as God doing it because you're using faith to tell that story. Another person who doesn't believe in God, doesn't have faith in God, he will not say that God saved me. He will say the driver was smart. So you see the angle? You can tell practically any story in the world, any history, any historical occurrence, thing that happened, you can tell it from 10 different perspectives, 10 different sides. Something happened in front of your house. You saw it, and then you saw the TV cameras also there. You saw Fox News, you saw MSNBC, you saw CBS, you saw all these television cameras there. But you saw the story too. You saw what happened exactly. And you go home and turn on your TV at night and see how that same event is reported in all the TV stations. You will see how different. You will have different, every camera is an angle. It's a way of telling the story. This is what is happening in the Bible. They were telling the stories, things that were happening to them, but they were telling it with faith perspective. God is the one telling them to do this. God says, I should marry your sister too and add it to my wives. They were marrying many women. It was not, there was, this is before the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are going to come in Exodus. So this is before the 10 Commandments, before Israel became Israel. They are not Israel now. Okay. Then there's another question here. In our school for pastoral ministry program, one theory was that Moses wrote Genesis, but that was questioned because Moses did not live to go to the promised land. Okay. Yes. So again, when we say somebody wrote something when it comes to the Bible, when we say somebody wrote something, again, we don't mean the one who picked the pen and wrote. When it comes to the books of the 5 books that we are going to see now, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that are called the 5 books of Moses. But Moses did not write them. Instead, Moses is the key hero in those books. That is why it is attributed. So many of the books of the Bible are like that. Many of the names that you see, the book of this, the book of that, it doesn't mean that person actually took a pen and penned it down. Authorship of the Bible is not about the exact writer. It is many times inspired. Whoever inspired a particular book, whoever gave, whose story is told in that book. So many of the biblical authorship are not exactly the ones who penned the books. So also with Moses. Okay? Moses did not write all those 5 books. Okay? But they are called the 5 books of Moses. Okay? I think we will stop here, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Next week, I have given you already the handout, so you can see that of Exodus. Please go through that, flip through your Bible, and look at those titles, those stories. And when we come together next Thursday, we'll talk about it. God bless all of you. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.